everybody. Come on, we practiced that yesterday. One more time. Good morning. Wonderful. Another great day in Stockholm. Well, you know, sitting back there, I wasn't really able to do the exercise that you just did, but I almost feel like taking a minute of my time and telling Alfred and Lisa and Annalie and Abigail and the staff how superlative they are, how generous, how wonderful, how special they are. I hope that comes later on, because it's been such a pleasure to work with them. Well, it's early in the morning, and I promise not to overwhelm you with complex algorithms and statistics and data and charts and graphs and things like that on the positive economy. In fact, an old friend of mine who had lots of experience speaking used to say that to this host when he was asked to speak, "Sure, you can give me any title that you want as long as I can speak about anything I want." And so in some respects, I will take a little bit of liberty in speaking about the positive economy. Mainly because it's so complex, and I do want to provide you a kind of a quick topographical survey of some elements that constitute an economy that is really serving the human being and not the other way around. And, you know, of course, you will have perhaps your own entry points into that, which are valid. I don't claim to be exhaustive, particularly not in 30 minutes or 35 minutes. But I would then also like to go a bit deeper and look at some, at least in my view, what I consider to be more foundational elements that would constitute or that would lead towards an unfolding economy that really is supportive of the human being. So maybe it's a bit irreverent to call the positive economy such as it is, and it's really an umbrella term, a kind of a fruit salad. But and those of you who are really awake will notice there are not only fruits in there, but anyway, the point is that it's all good for you. Now, these are just some of the areas that have been developed in this broad rubric of a positive economy that really seeks to do good rather than just do no harm. And each of these areas, you know, themselves would take hours and hours to elucidate and unpack for you. But they represent areas of approach that have been developed over time with lots of individual people and constitute facets or dimensions of what we generally would like to call the positive economy. And again, as I said, I make no claim on being completely exhaustive here. There may be others that you're aware of that are also important, but it just, I wanted to list these to show you that there is a tremendous amount over the last decade or so that has been developed, even more so, whether it's the circular economy, the blue economy, sharing economy, collaborative commons. You will be familiar with some in more detail, perhaps, than with others. So all of this belongs in this broad rubric of the positive economy. Oh, this goes quick. Hold on a second. Okay. So, you know, it looks like we have an object to follow. If you just take a minute to follow this, you realize it's maybe not so straightforward. And that's okay. I think we can kind of, you know, let ourselves come into the multi-dimensionality of the positive economy. A couple of elements, maybe, just to point out to you. And again, these are just a few elements, and some of you may be quite involved with the one or the other that I wanted to share with you. Let me take the top one here. Let's see, the B Corp. You may also have heard of the B Team with Richard Branson and Jochen Zeitz and others. But the B Corp, particularly emanating from the United States a number of years ago, is trying to separate what historically has really been you know, an iron wall between the not-for-profit world, the charitable world, and the do-gooders, and the other guys, you know, the business guys, and create also a legally valid public benefit corporation that is not just returning maximum value to its shareholders, but is a company and is a structure that also is providing benefit to the public and where now in over 30 states, for example, in the United States, companies that have been certified and registered as B corporations, as public benefit corporations, where the directors of those companies cannot be sued by the shareholders if they take decisions on the company that doesn't only return maximum financial benefit, but also has other benefits like social and environmental benefits. And that's a very important consideration, because often directors of companies take defensive positions in the decisions that they make, which are not always therefore the best. But this is just one example. Maybe another one, this was also very briefly mentioned in one of the talks yesterday, is an important publication that came out, written by Michael Porter and Mark Kramer, on shared values, which really try to indicate that shareholder value as opposed to, or stakeholder value as opposed to shareholder value, was really in the best interest even of large corporations. So for example, if you take a company like Nestle, it's important for them that their suppliers, maybe in developing countries, are stable and secure and do well because they are belonging to the supply chain of Nestle. So it's in their interest that they don't just extract the best possible price at the expense of health and welfare on their supply chain, but they really also support that supply chain to in the best possible way. So this is a very, very quick summary, but it was an important piece of thought leadership, and that has had a lot of implications. You know, going down the list, you see the GABV, that's the Global Alliance for Banking on Values. This is, I think, another important expression of the positive economy. These are about 25 so-called ethical banks, including one here in Sweden, the Ecobanken, probably having a balance sheet of somewhere about 50 billion or so. It's not huge. These banks are not huge, but they have a disproportionate impact in trying to make the deposits transparent to the depositors, and also really supporting a real economy that has the values that I think most of us would want to support. We've also seen, I think, in the last 10 years, a change in socially responsible investments that have typically been kind of so-called negative screens, taking out the so-called sin stocks in an investment strategy, you know, with like guns and alcohol, things like that, to a more active impact investment strategy where one is trying to deploy capital in a way that does specific good. And then social entrepreneurs, the platforms, the accelerators, the incubators, from Ashoka to the impact hubs, these are sprouting up all over the world and really supporting particularly young people who want to change the world for the better. So these are some elements, again, some characteristics. I'll just choose one or two important ones because I want to get through this part a little bit quicker. I think a really important element, also alluded to yesterday, is that in the positive economy, one really looks at the issue of what is called true price, or the issue of externalities that typically have been socialized by companies over the years. In other words, they produce something, they manufacture something, without taking into account the true cost of producing that, the benefits or the detriments in particular of pollution or hazardous waste or whatever else might be, that these are then passed on to consumers or other agencies. So in the positive economy, one wants to reward the positive externalities particularly of businesses. I think that's a very important element. So we don't call it the neutral economy. If you go to the bottom here, it's a positive economy that aims to do good rather than just do no harm. These are a couple of motivations that UBS has extracted from a study that they did of why it is that people do sustainable investing. And if you read the right-hand column, it is so that we sleep better at night, meaning that we align our portfolio, our investment portfolios, with our values. It's actually a very important point, and we can talk about it later if we have time. Wanting to make a difference, having a positive impact, and interestingly, and perhaps somewhat surprisingly to some of you, improve portfolio risk return. These are often elements that in an investment portfolio need to be evaluated, and particularly in 2008, we saw that people who were investing in the positive economy tended to suffer less than people who were in riskier areas of investment. Okay, that was a very brief topographical, very brief topographical survey, and there are many other pieces there. I think really the fundamental question, though, that we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about the positive economy is, what is our view of the human being? And perhaps it's something that we take for granted, you know, particularly if we're optimists or maybe also if we're pessimists, I don't know. But what is our view of the human being? Is our view that the human being is a mechanistic, mechanical input-output instrument? Is our view of the human being that he or she is creative, is capable of development, has a body, has a soul, has a spirit, can make decisions that are not only in his or her interest? And it may be interesting to take a minute at some point to imagine, to think, how do we think of the human being? And that is a fundamental question, because that really then creates our picture of what the economy can and should be. So I just chose this picture. It could be any other to indicate at least my view that the economy needs to be a human-centered economy that is serving the interests of a human being that does consist of body, soul, and spirit. However, the prevailing theory of macroeconomic theory and over the last couple centuries has been quite different. Again, this was very briefly alluded to, but the macroeconomic theory and the models that have been built up on this over the last couple centuries is really based on this guy. And he is a bit ridiculous, you're right. Purposely so. And he exhibits a number of characteristics, and they're important characteristics. It is a character. The Homo economicus doesn't really exist per se, obviously. That's why I could do this show you this cartoon character. But the economic theory of the late 19th century, and the one that has prevailed for quite a long time, is based on four primary characteristics. One is that the human being is only rational and acts according to reason. The second one is that we are self-interested, and our decisions are based on being self-centered, that we maximize utility as a consumer, that that's our focus, and that our behavior is always predictable. I don't know if you feel yourself recognized in that picture, but there he is. So that's the Homo economicus from the 19th century. And there's another picture that has come a bit later that stands in contrast to the Homo economicus, and that's the Homo reciprocans. And as it says in its name, it is based on the idea that human beings stand in reciprocal relationship to each other. And particularly depending on the motivations of the human being, we are able to provide mutual aid, we're able to compromise, collaborate, and interact with each other, particularly on a positive basis if our motivations are correct. So one might say, well, this is a bit of a trick quote that I'm putting here. I'm giving you advance warning. I'll just read the first part. It's a very poetic language, and I'm going to ask you who you think might have said this. But to restrain our selfish and to indulge our benevolent affections constitutes the perfection of human nature. Now, who do we think said that? Well, I'll tell you, I won't keep you in suspense. It was Adam Smith. Adam Smith, actually, in his most important book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, we always think of Adam Smith, or almost always think of Adam Smith, in regard to the invisible hand and the wealth of nations. But he was a moral philosopher, and this is a very important quote. Of course, he was a bit earlier as well. So, we can't avoid looking at and understanding the role of technology. In many ways, in many instances, the role of technology has been a tremendous boon, particularly in the sharing economy, where we have companies like Airbnb and Uber and Amazon and a number of others that have facilitated access to goods and a kind of a redistribution of underutilized assets in a way that really helps us, helps the consumer. It's a good side of technology, and there are many good sides of technology, but there's, in my view, a bad side, a dark side of technology that goes so fast and is so sophisticated that it supersedes our capacity to handle it. And again, this was referred to briefly, and this is just one example, in the stock trading of today. And so much of the stock trades that are done today are just done by very complex algorithms based on arbitrage formulas that take place in nanoseconds and have nothing to do with human decision, human insight, human wisdom, human inclinations. And these can trigger a huge degree of volatility in the marketplaces, where the entire market can lose a third of its value in a matter of minutes, literally a matter of minutes. It's extremely dramatic in this so-called high-frequency trading. You know, by now it's more than 84% of all stock trades are done by high-frequency computed, and a very small amount by individuals. And this little comment by Morgan Stanley already in 2012 points to this asynchronicity in the structures that we have and the technological or technical capacities that we have to perform stock trades. Yesterday also it was mentioned how quickly these trades go. Now, you may be more creative than me, but 1/2 millionth of a second is very hard for me to imagine how quick that is. Maybe you could imagine it, but I simply cannot. Stocks are held on average for about 5 days today. This is just one example, because these things, you know, there's a tremendous amount of churning going on. These are the finance markets. This has nothing to do with the real economy, with the real markets, with businesses that we're trying to build every day. So what do we want? We want deeper change. We don't just want tokenism. We want something actually quite different. I think the change that we're seeing is happening. Otto mentioned this a bit yesterday at 3 different levels, and they're all interlinked and they're connected with each other. They're happening at the micro level, the individual personal transformation level, at the meso level, the community level, and at the macro level, at the systemic change. And each one has a kind of a looping effect on the other. However, and there are examples of all of them, and I've pointed to a couple of them here. And they're quite promising and wonderful and need to collaborate as well to move the needle forward. Ultimately, in my view, I think the element of personal change is the most important one. It's the most difficult one as well. But I think that will lead then to a greater systemic change when more and more of us are able to transform and develop ourselves and understand that many of the choices are not black and white. You know, they are legitimate competing interests. And we do indeed need to develop a certain degree of wisdom and capacity to find our way forward. But the individual transformation seems to me to be most effective. So, taking that as background, I wanted to call on 2 old friends of mine, and perhaps yours as well. Very old friends, by the way, a couple thousand years. You may recognize these guys. They're important people, and I want to actually bring them into the context of the positive economy. It's Plato and Aristotle. This here, from Aristotle, student of Plato, I think is actually, it's a subtle element. It's one of the most important ones, I think, for us to consider. Because Aristotle was a pragmatist as well. And he says that ethics, the ethics that we have, are to be practiced. They're not just to be held. We have to practice them. It is a journey. As they lead to happiness, the ethics that we practice lead to happiness, or eudaimonia, human flourishing or well-being. He says we're not studying in order to know what virtue is, but to become good. To become good. And if I may indulge myself for a minute, on the plane up here, there was an article in the Flight magazine called Why Be Good? I think it was Scandinavian Airlines. I can't remember what I flew. Why be good? And the first sentence says this. An old man in Indiana named Glenn, Indiana in the United States, named Glenn, was once asked at a church meeting about his religion. He replied, "When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. That's my religion. Now, Glenn would have fallen into obscurity except for the fact that Abraham Lincoln tended to quote him and describe that as his own moral compass as well. So ethics is a matter of practice. Individual ethics is a matter of practice. We're not just learning about ethics to know them, but to become better people. So back to Plato. You may recall, and I would like to remind you about the so-called four Platonic virtues, the fundamental virtues, which I think are translatable today for the positive economy very directly. And I'm not going to test you on them, but it's interesting, and if we had more time, to actually talk about these pictures, these sketches, and what they mean. So look at the one on the top left. That's the first virtue. Just for a second. It's one of the, I think, most important ones, and it is called temperance, or modesty. In my language, technical financial term, I call it enoughness. When is enough enough? How much do we really need? These are private questions. You know, they're individual questions. They're, in a sense, situational. I can't decide when is enough for you, in a way, but I can decide when is enough for me. I can develop that as an ethic, as a practice, if you like. A certain amount of modesty, or as the picture shows, the right measure. It's a proportion. It's aesthetics. That's the first of the Platonic virtues. The second one is courage, as you can see. Fortitude. Now, in my view, it's no longer courage against the wolf. It's no longer an outer courage. It's an inner courage that we need to develop. It's a courage to stand up for our beliefs, to stand against the mainstream, if indeed that's what our beliefs say, to be willing to be who we are, to say what we think, to act according to what we feel and what we know. It's a courage of the heart. The third of the Platonic virtues, hold on a second. That would be hard to guess here on the left. But this is wisdom. Now, this reminds me a little bit of some pictures of St. George or St. Michael where St. George or St. Michael is holding the dragon but not killing it. This is overcoming the beast within ourselves. This is my interpretation. This is developing the capacity to judge, to inform ourselves. Again, a kind of a situational element that requires a degree of soul maturity. So if we can overcome this outer beast that lives within ourselves, then we have made a great step towards the capacity to judge and to express wisdom. And the fourth Platonic virtue is justice, rights for all, an extension of what we think is fair for ourselves to what we think is fair for everybody else, for others. Equal rights for all, a sense of the other. So these four Platonic virtues, I think, are really good tips from our friend Plato for how we can, at least in one way, build the positive economy. To summarize them again, we have temperance, modesty, reduced footprint, enoughness. Question we can always ask ourselves. Courage of our heart, a sense of our own conviction, acting with coherence, wisdom where knowledge becomes love, where we understand the context and the subtleties, and justice, a sense for the other, the community, and common good. These four elements versus these. Do you remember them? Homo economicus? There he is. Remember, I pointed out these four elements that are characteristics of the Homo economicus. And I've kind of, made a color correspondence. If we can balance consumerism with the idea of temperance and modesty, if we can overcome predictability with the courage of our own convictions, if we can embrace rationality, which is important, with wisdom, if we can defeat selfishness and self-centeredness with a sense of justice, I think there we have a paradigm for building a positive economy. Okay, so I did this. Now, I think these things are prerequisites, if you like, for the idea of what one of my favorite American transcendentalists, Henry David Thoreau, called to be awake. And to be awake isn't just to be awake. To be awake is to be awake. Do you get it? It's spiritually awake. It's a wonderful quote. Now, this was in 1854, in a very well-known book that he writes. To be awake is to be alive, to be spiritually awake. And we maybe sometimes feel little moments of this where we understand that a moment has just happened, something has just happened that's important, or something that is happening. We feel not just physically awake, but we feel connected with something larger. Now, Thoreau felt that there was only 1 in 100 million who was awake to a poetic or divine life. And I think that's probably changed quite a lot. And I don't know quite if it's the same thing. It's a hypothesis. And many of you will remember this. It's almost old hat to quote this about the cultural creatives. This was like 15 years ago. This was a study that Paul Ray and Sherry Anderson did in 2002. And probably all of us belong to the cultural creatives. But they did a study of certain kinds of people, many of them belonging to the LOHAS group, if you like. But these are people who combine a serious focus on their spirituality with a strong passion for social activism. And there are different degrees of being a so-called cultural creative. But in the end, they estimated that just in Europe, there are between 80 and 90 million cultural creatives. It's an army. But one of the characteristics is that the cultural creatives feel alone. We all feel alone. We feel that we're not part of a larger group. It's an interesting element. So I want to bring that at least in some correspondence with this idea of being awake from Henry David Thoreau. And I think that many more people are awake. There is really something happening in our collective consciousness. So one of the things that I think people understand is that values, this is very important, values are the best single predictor of behavior. That is, the ethics that we practice, remember Plato, the ethics that we can develop and practice not only lead to happiness, now remembering Aristotle, lead to a sense of well-being and human flourishing, but they're the best predictor of our real behavior. And here's some elements that you can see that belong to what has been characterized as a cultural creative. So just a couple of quotes, one from Central Europe, and one from the West, one from the East, about the role of ethics in the economy. This is Tomáš Sedlacek from the CSOB Bank in the Czech Republic. Ethics forms the core of economics. Ethics forms the core of economics. Or we have Robert Reich recently in September. An economy depends fundamentally on public morality. Public morality, it's an interesting concept. Or the Dalai Lama, also mentioned here, talking about the role of business in society. If you just take a minute to read this, this is a lot more interesting to me than one of the proponents of the neoclassical theories, Milton Friedman, who said, the business of business is business. Okay. Compared to that, I think we have different expectations, different hopes, and perhaps also different possibilities. So, there's another point. To make this real and to make it stick. And this is a picture that some of you may recognize from a country I love almost as much as Sweden. It's beautiful, particularly the right side. But it's a bit dangerous, actually. Just when we're kind of in the warm soup of wisdom, we realize it may be a bit more precarious than we thought. And this is perhaps not such a popular point, but for me it's a really important point because we are at the edge. I think if we try to be awake, this is not necessarily a continual state of bliss and divine happiness, by no means. We actually, I think, many of us go through what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. And I see this again and again in the economy. I see guys who are, have been active on Wall Street for a number of years, and then they hit the wall. And because they've been living a schizophrenic existence. They have an inner life, they have some yearnings, they have some intimations, a sense of things, and then they have their other life. And whether it's a divorce, whether it's an illness, an accident, or whatever it is, a kind of an opening, a kind of something that catalyzes or precipitates a reflection, a deeper and profound reflection that has been called the dark night of the soul. It's legitimate. And I think it's important not to pretend it doesn't exist for many of us. Because it also allows us to go through a process and a transformation where some of these ethics and some of the ideas on happiness, on well-being, on the positive economy can really take root in more fertile soil. So I wanted at least to point to this because it's often glossed over, the dark night of the soul. It will help us avoid this sort of a thing. And I know this is a bit controversial as well, because some people say, look, mindfulness is so great that even, it's intrinsically great. So even if it's mech mindfulness or it's this or it's that, it still will open something up, and that thing has a power, and that thing eventually will overcome. That may be the case. But there is perhaps some caution to spiritual materialism. This brings us to yeah, I'm glad you're laughing. To the gap, I call it the gap, which is, we have our ideals and then we have our reality. And, they're not always so easy to bring together. Great ideals, and our daily life is a little bit different. Here's another one. It's one of my favorites is peanuts. I love mankind. It's just people I can't stand. Yeah, anybody who's worked in groups and is an idealist may have touched a little bit. I don't want to, come too close or anything, but so there's a struggle. This gap is also real, and it's good that it's real because that allows us to journey. So how can we bring all of this together? Our motivations, our practice. How can we develop a kind of an ethical coherence? Again, step by step. I think in some ways, to summarize, also referring a little bit to what Otto mentioned to us yesterday, we know a lot. If we can bring into some kind of coherence what we know, because we know so much more than we actually feel, but if we can begin to feel a little bit what we know, then it might be easier for us to do what we know or to do what we feel. And this is kind of a whole person approach, our head, our heart, and our hands, our thinking and our whole emotional feeling life, and our life of will, our life of activity. And these are connected to, and I'll perhaps finish with this, to what I call the 3 C's, conscience, connectedness, and commitment. Now, for me, conscience is also a very private matter. It's not, well, I'm not talking about the moral majority here. It's something each one of us individually has to discover and find and learn and explore, and it's changing. It's also a journey. And, it's where we can test what we know and where we can test also what we feel. It sort of lies a little bit between the border of what we know and what we feel. This connectedness is how we feel about the world, how we feel about our fellow human beings, our brothers and our sisters, and what the implications of that are. And then the commitment is how we can translate that into actual activity in an everyday sense, how we can connect ourselves and participate in the positive economy. So these are some elements that have to do with a personal transformation and personal ethics that ultimately, I think, can lead and will build us to a bigger positive economy, however we connect to it and in whatever way. And I think with that, my time is up. So thank you very much.